Hi there. My name is Ann Thompson. I am an alumna of the University of Notre Dame, and I am a correspondent for NBC News. And today I get to be your moderator for our discussion about the upcoming U.S. election and its consequences for democracy here at home and around the world. When we look at this election, the easiest way to sum it up is we've all seen this movie before. Two presidential candidates whose positions and attitudes are well known and who use and see power very differently. Here to discuss what is at stake, we have three tremendous thinkers on democracy. Starting down at the end, the man in the blue shirt and navy blue jacket is Frank Langfitt. He is NPR's global democracy correspondent, and how impressive it is that NPR thinks it's worth a beat. That's really impressive. Frank has reported from all around the world. His datelines include Kyiv, Shanghai, Nairobi, and London, and today he is based in Washington, D.C. Next to Frank is Christina Wolbrecht, a political science professor and the C. Robert and Margaret Hanley Family Director of Notre Dame's Washington program. Christina focuses on politics and gender and is the co-author of a new book, See Jane Run, How Women Politicians Matter for Young People, and it comes out next October. And next to Christina is her co-author, David Campbell, the director of Notre Dame's Democracy Initiative. He is also the Packey J.D. Professor of American Democracy. David's scholarship focuses on civic and political engagement with special attention to young people and religion. And despite his all-American appearance, he is Canadian. Yeah, exactly. So we're going to start with a jump ball for our panel, and that is, as we prepare for the upcoming election, how healthy is our democracy here in the U.S.? Is it teetering? Is it robust? Is it in danger of collapsing or morphing into another form of government? David, how healthy do you think it is?
Well, on these sorts of panels, I have historically played the role of the optimistic one, the one telling everybody to calm down. I have to say, though, that this time around, I'm not saying calm down, because I do think there is cause for concern. However, I will say there is also some cause for optimism, and here's why. While at the top, we have many political leaders who are openly questioning democratic norms and acting in ways that we would not historically have expected here in the United States as a liberal democracy. When you go from the top and actually talk to regular everyday Americans, there is still, according to the data, a robust sense of what it means to be part of a democratic society, which is an interesting disconnect because we often think of the average voter as maybe not being so well informed or acquainted with what we mean by democratic values, and it's those at the top who maybe were better socialized to understand what it really means to be part of a democracy. But we are in a current era that, at least on one side of the political spectrum, that has been totally reversed. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned. We should be. There are still many people out there, your friends and neighbors perhaps, who might be holding views that are concerning about the state of democracy. But I think it is easy to dismiss the fact that again and again, American voters have demonstrated that they do actually care about their country as a country, that they care about the state of American democracy, and hopefully that will be the case in 2024 again. And I don't say that as a partisan statement, but I just say that as someone who cares about the health of the system that we have in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Christina, from where you sit, how healthy is U.S. democracy?
So I think I agree with Dave, and I'm not usually the optimist, that things look dire. And the fact that they look dire is important not just for this country and for people in it, but of course for the rest of the world. One of my concerns is there's this sense that people are waiting for that moment, that the tanks roll down the streets, and we know that democracy has ended. All of my comparativist colleagues in this room are laughing under their breath right now because, of course, that's not how democracy ends. And I worry that we are having a hard time getting through in helping people understand how real that threat is. That threats against election workers threaten the integrity of our on-the-ground structure of democracy, because no one wants to be firebombed or threatened or have their names in the papers. I worry that this, refusal to accept the outcome of elections, the very thing that makes a democracy is losers' consent. And that just sounds like, well, we all complain and we all say crazy things on the internet now, instead of understanding that as a really important undermining of a key norm that makes democracy possible. We have known, as Dave has been suggesting, that democracy depends not just on its institutions, but on civil society and the acceptance and advancement of certain commitments to the way in which we engage in a political society. And as those slowly erode, and I think erode is the right word, again, I think there are plenty of people sounding the alarm, but not behaving, but maybe not seeing quite the response that we'd like to see to sort of defend it. There are other models, as again, people in this room can tell us, where in the face of an authoritarian personality that the party could refuse him or could, in other places link up with the opposition or take other sorts of action, and we really don't see that happening. And that's the part that I see really disturbing, that everyone who wants to be Trump's vice presidential candidate has to say that they don't think, they think 2020 was stolen. That sort of takeover of one of the major parties in our country is probably the most threatening piece, I think, for democracy. There have always been authoritarian voices, but to have that take over one of our two major parties is a real threat.
I deal in the world of facts, and one of the frustrating things is that even though, and Frank deals in the same world, even though there have been investigations in Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there has been no evidence of election tampering in 2020, that the election was stolen, and yet people are not willing to accept that as a fact. I mean, how frustrating is it to the two of you as academics that there is a myth out there, and somehow, even if you say it as a reporter, you're branded as anti one side or pro the other side, when it's just a fact?
So we're academics, so we're used to no one believing us. I think it must be much harder for you, Anne.
It's very different.
I think, and again, speaking to this audience, I think what you put your finger on at the end is I think the challenge, which is that as scholars, we want to understand, how does democracy work? How does it not work? What are the factors that encourage it or discourage it? But in this country at this time, for me to stand up in front of my Introduction to American Politics students and say, behaving in this way undermines democracy, when most, but not all, most of your examples are from one side versus the other, raises concerns among students, questions of bias, et cetera. And so I think we're in a tricky period in our profession of trying, and sounds like you as well, of trying to distinguish between, these are our standards for democracy, this is whether or not we're meeting them, as opposed to, I am siding with one political side or the other.
It's also worth noting that it's actually really hard to figure out what percentage of Americans really do think that 2020 was stolen, or any of a variety of other dubious claims that are often repeated within at least Republican circles. And the reason I say that is we have some reason to think that when people are asked these questions on a survey by a reporter, maybe even just in conversation that people respond in a way that is sometimes called partisan cheerleading, that they are saying the thing that they think they're supposed to say because that's what you say if you think the way I do. Now, maybe that's a distinction without a difference, but it is itself an interesting phenomenon if repeating something that maybe you think is true, maybe you don't, but you nonetheless say it because you feel that's an identity marker. On the one hand, that maybe is something we can take some solace in. Well, maybe they don't really believe that. On the other hand, maybe that's actually worse because it suggests that repeating things that you may not necessarily think are true is nonetheless the thing I ought to do in order to fully represent my team. And perhaps in people's brains, the distinction between what you really believe and what you just say because that's what you're supposed to say in order to cheerlead for your side becomes a distinction that no longer has any meaning.
Frank, you've spent 30 years overseas in China, London, Ukraine, just to name a few of your passport stamps. What is the reputation of American democracy today from the global viewpoint, and how has that changed in the 30 years you have been abroad?
I think it's declined a lot since 2016. I was in London on election eve. I was at the U.S. Embassy, a lot of British officials and other people there. And afterwards, the response in the UK and in Brussels, I spent a lot of time in Brussels as well and elsewhere on the continent. I think Europeans who said, well, we thought we knew the United States. And obviously, that was a legitimate election between two candidates with very different vision. But I think that they were very unsettled because one is some of the authoritarian tendencies of former President Trump. And the way they've used it since then is each election, I think in Europe and elsewhere, is a determinative of what America really is. Is it a democracy? Is it a country that has shared values or not? And the jury remains very much out. I was again in London on January 6th, and the reaction there was just horror, absolutely. I think when I look at America's reputation, though, and I'm glad you asked, in terms of time, I would say that I saw it change after the 90s. I lived in Beijing in the 1990s, and back then, as you would all remember, Bill Clinton was in office. The United States was at peace, it had no wars overseas, and it was running budget surpluses. And the attitude of the Chinese, at that time, the Chinese economy was maybe 7th or 8th in the world, around the side of Spain and Italy, was how do you guys do it? It was absolutely admiring. The lines in the dead of winter outside of the consulate in Beijing would stretch for blocks. I left China in 2002. Came back to the States, returned in 2011, got into a taxi cab in Shanghai, and one of the first things the taxi cab driver said is, why does America like to go to war so much? And the impact of the Iraq War in 2003 was profound all over the world. And again, that is a self-inflicted wound by a democracy. Then, when you look at the global financial crisis, 2008, the subprime mortgage crisis, the impact that had around the world. At that point, you had the leaders of China saying, you can no longer lecture us about how we run our economy and our finances. And so one of the things, in addition to what we've seen in the last 8 years in terms of the erosion of democracy in the United States, is also, decisions that have come out of a democratic system that have gone very badly and have affected a lot of other countries and their economies. So I'm sorry to say, I've watched sort of a general decline. That said, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in November, and I think people do remain open to the United States. People always talk, as they hear, but overseas, of the resilience of this system and its ability to course correct, which you don't see right now, obviously, in Beijing or in Moscow.
The three of you have mentioned January 6th, and on that day, I can remember the universal horror at what we saw happen in the Capitol. Since that time, it has changed. It is now, some people say they want to say it was just tourists who did something a little wrong. Or, I mean, some people have gone so far as to call the people who were convicted of trespassing and worse on that day hostages. What does that tell us? The change in how January 6th is portrayed, what does that tell us about the health of democracy in this country? Is it just a partisan issue, or is it something more? Frank?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think it's the information system. I'm a little like the Rip Van Winkle on this panel. I just got back to the United States last year, having left in 2010 for East Africa. So I've read a lot, but I didn't see all that much. One thing that strikes me, and it comes back to disinformation, is we all know that there is not a shared sense of facts and reality in this country, and that is fundamental to making, decisions at the ballot box and about policy. And I'd just like to make a comparison with the United Kingdom, which was the last place I was posted for 7 years. I arrived a week before the Brexit vote, so I stayed very busy during that time. It was the most chaotic time in British politics since the end of the war. But what was fascinating, even though there's a partisan press in the United Kingdom, is there was a general agreement on a lot of facts. So when Boris Johnson was holding parties during COVID lockdown, and the Queen was social distancing at the funeral of her husband, people were outraged. And there was no difference in terms of people's attitudes towards this because everybody had a shared reality. Here in the United States, it is a hyper-partisan press. There is a lot of disinformation that comes out of what used to be semi-mainstream media. And that's the huge difference that I notice coming back. Even the United Kingdom, which has many, many problems, doesn't face this, sort of cognitive dissonance that we have in the United States, where there isn't an agreement on some of the basic facts surrounding what's happened historically in the last few years here.
So what I would add to that is that happens in a context of what political scientists call partisan sorting. So in the Federalist number 10, Madison said one of the things that'll make a democracy work in a large system, a large country like the United States, is there would be overlapping memberships. And so while I might side with my fellow churchgoers on one particular issue, I would maybe side with my fellow union members on another, and maybe as a member of a certain social class or ethnic group, I would have a different set of preferences. And that what this would mean is that our competition could never become too heated, because the people on the other side, while you might disagree with them on one issue, you're going to agree with them on another. One of the things we've seen in the United States in the last 30-some years is a decline in those overlapping identities as our sort of identities have really sorted in important ways. And so white, Christian, Republican, right? Secular, racially diverse is Democrat, et cetera, right? So not complete, but awfully strong. And what political scientists have shown is that when you sort this way, when everyone sort of lines up in the same way, and you agree with the people at church and the people at work and the people of your racial group, right, it becomes very easy to vilify the other side and see them as completely separate and opposite from you. And it also becomes the case that you really come to strongly identify with that team, right? All of my people are over here, and I really want my team to win. And if you tell me that we actually lost the election and that lots of people didn't actually support my team, that's unacceptable, right? I was at the Ohio State game in the fall, and everyone was so dejected when that game was lost at the last minute, right? They didn't lose, but everyone was very sad walking out of the stadium, right? I don't want to admit that my team is not the best team.
I just want to note that that game was stolen. It's just very clearly stolen.
I thought he was going to say the other, which is he also wants to note that's the first football game Christina had gone to in like a decade. These are both, but I had the sports analogy and I had to bring it up. We are at Notre Dame, folks. Right, and so group identity is fundamental to our social psychology. Who are we, right? And a very fundamental part of human nature is to seek ego, to feel good about ourselves. And so when our team wins, we feel great. And when Donald Trump stands up and says, we're true Americans and this is our future and we're gonna make America great again, that's, yes, people like me, right? I'm very much a strong identity. And so that idea of partisanship is part of who you are. And when my team wins, it's good. And when my team loses, it's terrible. Is a great environment for misinformation, et cetera, right? Helps explain some of the dynamics Dave was just talking about. Why do people say that there were more people at Donald Trump's inauguration than at any other inauguration in American history, even though we can all look at photographs, right? Because my team must be the good team. This is a little like, again, you guys don't know what a stretch sports metaphors are for me, right? But before the season, yeah, we've got a great quarterback this year. I think we're going to go all the way, right? I need to believe in my team because it's part of my identity.
Dave, what do you think? What does the interpretation of January 6th today compared to in the 24, 48 hours after it happened, what does that say about our democracy?
Well, it certainly underscores the point that Frank was making about the different information environments that people live in. But I think it also underscores another fact about American life today that I think builds on what Christina was saying, which is we live in a country where almost everything has become politicized. And what that results in is a society where it is very difficult for people who disagree with one another politically to come together and find things to talk about that don't end up becoming politically charged. There are some rare examples of those points of agreement among Americans that are not necessarily partisan or politicized, but they're becoming fewer and fewer. Where we eat, where we shop, the car you drive, where you live. And it is for this reason that I am grateful for Kristi Noem. Because Kristi Noem, this is true, she demonstrated something that I had long suspected, but we now know is true, which is that one of the few things that all Americans, red, blue, purple, can agree on is that we love our dogs. And there is actual data on this that cats, very polarizing. It's true. This is actually absolutely true. Dogs, not. And so when we all learned that Kristi Noem had killed cricket, left, right, center, everyone was horrified. I use that as a somewhat whimsical example, although rest in peace, cricket, to underscore the fact that we are at a point in the United States, and again, I don't mean to sound overly dramatic, but it really is true, where I fear that we are going to rip apart as a country because so many of the things that used to unify Americans no longer do. And an example of, like January 6th just underscores that you'd think that we could all agree that storming the Capitol to overthrow an election, that's something we should all agree is maybe not healthy. And we did, as a country, for about 72 hours. And then, the half-life of that has worked its way through the system. I will, however, come back to the point that I was making earlier, that when you look at the data across the country, we do see some evidence that, just as an example, support for political violence, this is a contested issue among political scientists, how much support is there? But even those who are raising the alarm about support for violence in the United States, the numbers are still relatively low. And that's why there's a debate among political scientists of whether or not we should be concerned about this. So it's not as though there's a huge number of Americans who are saying, if my team loses in 2024, we are going to march in the streets. That doesn't seem likely. What's more likely is this subtle erosion that Christina was talking about earlier of what we had long thought to be just unshakable norms here in American democracy.
Christina, you mentioned the Federalist Papers. How far do you think we are from the vision of Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, back then to where America is today? How far are we from those democratic ideals? Or are we doing a good job?
So I think it's important to see the accomplishments of the founders in their own time period and to recognize that their vision of a mass democracy, separation of powers, checks and balances, was in its way very radical for its time. It's also important to say that at the time of the writing of this radical document, about 5% of people who lived in the United States had the right to vote and participate in the choosing of their leaders. And so I think it would be fair to say, by modern standards of democracy, that that's not very impressive. But I want to use that to make a broader point, which is that it is certainly accurate to say that the history of the United States up until this very moment is one about contestation about who should be part of the political community. You know, the Constitution begins, "We the people." The question is, who are the people? Who has a voice? Who matters? Who should be part of the United States? And as you know, I study women's suffrage, and so there's a long, ongoing conflict about how much women actually belong in politics and what sort of voice they should have. The story, of course, of the enfranchisement of African Americans in this country is one of, required a civil war and then, was pulled back again by Jim Crow and had to be fought over again in the 20th century and is being fought over again today in a post-Shelby world. What about Chinese immigrants? What about indigenous folks, right? This is a recurrent theme in American politics. And we have absolutely seen that in these last elections, including 2016, right? Who is a real American? Who really counts? When you say make America great again, for who are you making it great again? Donald Trump once said that he won a majority of women's votes in 2016. That is an accurate statement if you only count white women. It is not an accurate statement if you have a broader definition of who is part of the American community. And so I think that the framers were trying to construct something new and original, a way of government by the people. But even then, their definition of who the people were, while radical for its time, was extraordinarily limited. And what we have seen in these past elections is that this is not ever settled. This is contested. It can roll back or it can roll forward, and that is something I'm really concerned about going into 2024. I'll say one last thing about that. And so, both parties are working on mobilizing their supporters. Democrats usually have more elaborate systems about this. But the Trump campaign is also mobilizing 100,000 election observers who they want to be in polling places, demanding to see the papers or the validation of particular kinds of voters. They're probably not going to ask me. Right? And so this is another, just the idea that you would do this is itself, I think, radical and democracy threatening.
So what role will election integrity then play in this election? I mean, are we looking at a long drawn out result and a result that will be contested in courts for months to come? Are we prepared for that as a nation? This is
I just got back. I think people are, there's an advantage for the country in that none of this should come as a surprise to anybody. If anything comes down the pike, people won't be saying, "Oh, never saw that before." So that is an advantage in terms of jurisdictions being able to prepare. I was in Wisconsin recently and talking to one of the county clerks, and his concern there, it's obviously extremely tight in Wisconsin, was there would be challenges in certain places that would simply stop the vote. It would prevent the ability to actually declare someone the winner, and then they would try to throw it to the legislature or to another branch that would be favorable. And so they've thought all this through and exactly how prepared they are in terms of the election commissions and things. Of course, and the election commission in Wisconsin is very divided. But I think people have been preparing for this for quite some time, and certainly they're going to be far more prepared than they were in 2020. But I think there is a concern. On the other hand, the general sense is that if former President Trump wins, that will probably be it, because there hasn't been, there isn't much election fraud in this country.
I think another dimension here, and these things are not unrelated, is, a long campaign on the right to hollow out the state, which is to reduce taxes, to reduce capacity, et cetera. Our election administration in the United States, it depends on small budgets in counties and states. It depends largely on volunteers who are now afraid to volunteer because there's threats of violence. People are, the President of the United States is calling you on the phone, telling you to find some more ballots, your name's out there, all these sorts of things. And so we made some steps about this after 2000. Maybe we don't all, I just gave away my age. Another contested election where there were questions about election administration and et cetera, and Congress passed some bills to try to strengthen these systems. But at the end of the day, you're a county council, and you're deciding whether or not to fill, holes in your road, which people notice and are upset about, or get newer voting machines, or deal with different issues about counting machines. Those are hard decisions to make. A lot of county governments very much hurt by the COVID pandemic and those extra expenses, et cetera. And so I want to say volunteer. I want to say, vote for more taxes in your local governments, but we're up against a 30-year campaign that suggests that we don't need more money in government, and taxes are bad, and government should do as little as possible. Man, if we can't run our own elections, if we're somehow as Reagan said, the shining city on the hill, that's really troubling.
Christina makes a great point. I'd like to follow up a little bit more about what I saw in Wisconsin. So you see, there's even one town where they've lost, I think, they're on their 4th election commissioner in about 3 years. Wow. And the fear is, especially with this election and the stakes, it's going to be very difficult. At the same time, in talking to the election people in Wisconsin, they are training all the time. They are doing a ton of training. It's not like they don't know that this isn't a risk. I met with the United States Attorney in Madison. They are watching threats of violence very, very closely. And the reason I went to see him is because he was circulating quietly documents to all the election commissioners around Wisconsin, warning them of certain kind of threats that were already percolating up several months ago. So they are very aware of it. They are trying to make sure that everybody can run these elections as carefully and as properly as possible, because they know that any sort of irregularity is the thin edge of the wedge, a thin edge of the wedge.
I mean, as we know, prediction is hard, especially about the future. And so as we look forward to what might happen post-election in 2024, we of course really don't know. We had reason to think in 2020 that there was going to be trouble post-election day 2024, or 2020. There were certainly lots of articles being written about what might happen. Nobody anticipated January 6th in quite the way that it unfolded. So I think we should be careful of trying to predict what might actually unfold. But Frank makes a good point that this time around, I think election officials and all the rest of the apparatus that goes into running an election are certainly, they've certainly had the possibility of the worst possible outcome or the worst possible consequence put in front of them in a way that perhaps in 2020 wasn't real. Now, as Christina has noted, on the other hand, there are forces mobilizing to put poll watchers in place and to issue legal challenges and whatnot. So I would be hesitant to make a prediction one way or the other, except that I will go on the record saying this: it's going to be close. You can write that down.
Aren't you glad you came to this panel?
Yeah.
They don't give these PhDs out to just anybody.
Frank, you were in Israel in December, and you say you saw the evolution of democracy firsthand. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I know that when we talk about democracy around the world and here in the United States, it can be pretty downbeat. But there are a lot of positive stories out there. I mean, Poland is a very good one. Guatemala is a very good one. And I found Israel fascinating. I was in the West Bank and in Israel for most of December. And one of the stories I did was just looking at what had happened after the Netanyahu government tried to put through its judicial reform, which was widely seen by many people as removing the judiciary as a check and balance on the executive and the Knesset, meaning there was, and there are fewer checks and balances in the Israeli system than there are here in the United States. And I talked to some of the organizers of protests, and at first when this happened and Netanyahu's government was pushing this agenda, they thought people's eyes would glaze over, and that's not what happened at all. Hundreds of thousands of people came out into the streets, that it really resonated for them. And they said, you know, one of the reasons that they care about the country, obviously, is they see it as a democracy. Again, going to Christina's point, a very imperfect democracy in terms of who actually gets to vote. And what was fascinating was I spent time with a group called Brothers and Sisters in Arms. And they were military reservists, very sophisticated people, many of them running the top tech companies in Israel. And they were drawn to the protests because, as one of the soldiers told me, he'd been a submarine operator, he'd said, if we don't have a legitimate democratic system, how do I know when I'm on a submarine that I'm getting a legitimate order? If I cannot trust a government to make these kinds of decisions. So brothers and sisters came out with huge numbers of people. Then after October 7th, as you would remember, the Israeli government was not only caught unawares, but was actually largely unable to respond very quickly. So ordinary people, including NGOs, went down to the border and rescued people. And so Brothers in Arms got even more involved there, as did others, coming in and filling a gap in this horrible, horrible thing that happened that the government wasn't able to do. As I was spending time with Brothers and Sisters in Arms in December, they kept talking about the system, and I said, so are you guys going to start a political party? And then within like 3 or 4 weeks, they had done exactly that. And so you had a whole group of extremely sophisticated, thoughtful patriots who had not been politically involved, but because of the attack on Israeli democracy, the Netanyahu government had actually galvanized them and created a very sophisticated opposition. And I looked at this and saw this is really fascinating, and it was about people standing up for what they believed in and getting more involved. It will be very interesting when there is an election at the end of this war, or a long pause in this war, to see what happens. But I certainly, as a reporter, I want to be back in Israel covering that, because it's been fascinating to watch. And it shows that when you attack democracy, which is what was happening, the kind of unintended consequences that can result. The Netanyahu government was really creating an opposition that wasn't there before.
So does this mean that democracy is resilient?
I mean, certainly in Israel it was. I mean, I think when I was there, when you talk to people, this was something they were also very proud of it. They were very proud that they came out in the streets and that they actually had a big impact on the government. And they have now halted that, not just the war. The war obviously paused the government's efforts, but also the Supreme Court actually threw out the one thing that the Knesset was able to pass. So now they are back to square one. And I think Israelis that I talked to took great pride in their willingness to go up there and challenge the government and stop the legislation.
Christina, as we look at this election, what are the key standards for democracy?
For a long time, those of us who study American politics got to assume democracy, like we're an economist or something. Assume. This turned out to be very poor decision making on our front. So I'm going to steal from Dave, who I think made a point in another event we ran yesterday that I think is exactly right on. So I'm at least going to give him credit while I steal his idea in front of him, which is, we've mentioned this idea of losers' consent, that democracy is a system in which the incumbent sometimes loses elections and leaves office. we sort of lost hold of that in 2020 in a really shocking way. I know Ann and I were speaking beforehand, again, having lived through the 2000 election, which was all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made a decision that lots of people, including, I'm guessing, Al Gore, disagreed with, and nonetheless, this is our political process, the court has ruled, and I now, step back and say I lost that election, I concede, and George Bush II becomes president. I'm really concerned about that standard, that expectation that elections have consequences. I think there are other standards of democracy that we talk a little bit less about, or don't always jump out at us. And again, I would talk about things like voting rights, access to decision-making, this idea that there is, that sort of certain liberties and rights are protected. We cannot have a flourishing democratic government without a free press, for example, which is under attack both from governments and also from capitalism, to say it briefly. These are the kinds of pieces of democracy that is so multifaceted and is being attacked in so many different directions that I think one of the conclusions of our work in the last 8 years in sort of thinking about what's happened through 2016 is just be reminded of how many different standards there are and how they are being attacked, so many of them are being attacked in so many different ways.
One of the things I think that democracy demands is basic respect. Respect of people who have opinions different than yours. And I worry that we have become so siloed, whether it is, as you said, in our media consumption, our friends, we no longer talk to each other. We don't talk to each other because we don't want to offend each other, we don't want to get in arguments, but in not talking to each other, we don't understand each other, and democracy at its core, at least what I remember and what I learned in school, was that it's a compromise. It's not a zero-sum game. Have we lost that? I mean, have we lost the ability to talk to each other? And if that is the case, does that itself threaten our democracy?
Unfortunately, I have to agree with you, Anne, that going back to my earlier point about so many aspects of American life being politicized, that in turn makes it difficult for people to have a conversation where they may disagree, because we have forgotten, or in some cases maybe never learned, how to disagree with one another, which is not an easy thing to do. Most human beings are averse to conflict. We don't like to have conflict. Think of the typical conversation you might have with someone on an airplane, the dreaded seatmate who wants to talk about what you do for a living or where you're from. Think about those kinds of conversations. What are they about? They're about finding some sort of point of commonality. That, oh, I'm from this place. Oh, I have a cousin who used to live there, right? That's what human beings gravitate toward. And so when we're confronted with conflict, it's not something that we're naturally accustomed, at least most people, to deal with. So somehow, as a society, we have to figure out, how do we learn to disagree with one another? And I'm not sure what to do about you all, about adults, because you're probably a lost cause. But I do think that there is hope for young people. And this is actually one of the great tragedies of what's happened to civic education in our schools just in the last few years. So I will just begin by saying that it is a myth that civics is no longer taught in American schools. Sometimes you hear that refrain. That is actually not true. In fact, over the last 10 to 20 years or so, a number of states have actually increased the civics instruction that students receive. So it's not necessarily the quantity that's the issue, it's the quality. Because research into civic education, including but not limited to some of my own, has shown that the single most effective form of civic education, that is to teach young people how to be active participants in a democracy and to ensure that they are knowledgeable, is to confront them with real world issues in the classroom. that the lively exchange of ideas in a classroom setting, led by a professional who knows how to get those conversations going and to keep them from spiraling out of control, that is far and away the most effective form of civic education. And unfortunately, because of the number of states that have now made it difficult for teachers to say what they wish or what they feel they ought to, or to introduce controversial issues within the classroom, there has been a chilling effect. And even in places where they do not have a law that necessarily restricts what teachers can do, we have lots of reason to think that teachers are nonetheless personally censoring themselves from those sorts of conversations in the classroom. And this is a tragedy, because that is where our next generation are going to learn how to disagree with one another. And if they don't learn that, then we are destined to be in this doom loop that we're in now, where we can't function as a group of people who have conflicting ideas. And I wish I had a more positive note, but I don't. Except to say, be sure that you express this opinion. I hope I can convince you that this matters, so that our policymakers recognize that what's happening in our schools is an absolute tragedy and could very well have serious long-term implications for the health of American democracy. End of sermon.
Yeah, I would just follow up, sort of returning to the question about standards of democracy. And one of the major sort of components of the American political system is supposed to be majority rule with minority rights, right? So there are things that the majority can't do to the minority, but that there is this sense that majorities rule. And so we've talked here a lot about individual people and voting and et cetera, but I really want to emphasize the challenges to this idea of majority rule in the United States. And it comes to these sort of, if we just educated more, people just voted more, et cetera, right? We have a political system, as you were just saying, that has many more checks and balances than virtually any other political system in the world. If you want to stop things from happening, it is much easier than if you want to succeed in getting things through. If you want to get through the Senate, you got to get past the filibuster. If you want to get, presidents are elected by an electoral college that is malapportioned and gives more of a say to smaller states with smaller populations than it does to larger states with larger populations, et cetera, right? And so we can educate our students, we can encourage turnout, and if we're looking for a positive sign of democracy, turnout in American elections since 2016 is higher than it's been in decades. We have convinced people that elections matter and that there are really important stakes. But the truth is, majorities don't rule regularly in the United States. Hillary Clinton won by 6 million votes in 2016, but the Electoral College fell a very different way. That's our system, that's the rules of the game, so she lost. But these sort of more fundamental questions about how we express preferences are really important. And I guess what I would say is there are people who want to monitor elections and want to change rules and change the press and keep down dissent, are because they're maintaining minority rule in the United States rather than majority rule in the United States. Unfortunately, if we can get people paying enough attention to participate in elections, we're doing really well. To then tell them we need to reform the Electoral College or we need to change the way the Senate works or whatever that might be is a much harder sell.
Frank, I want to end with you. What do you see the impact of this election being on the world at large?
I think huge. Okay, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine. And I just saw one of my translators when I was there at the beginning of the war. I just saw her a few days ago, and she said that everybody that she knows, one of her brothers is in the military, are terribly concerned about what the decision will be like on November 5th in this country. Because Mr. Trump has a very different vision than Mr. Biden. We've already seen what's happened on Capitol Hill in terms of getting funding to Ukraine. Without American funding and leadership, wow, there would be Russian tanks probably past Kyiv. No, I mean, they would have taken over the country. They wouldn't be able to run it, but they would have taken over the country. And Ukraine can be described, I think, very much as an issue, a sort of a very clear issue of democracy and sovereignty. So from a Ukrainian perspective, they're very concerned about what a Trump administration would look like. no president can unilaterally pull out of NATO, but you can stop answering the phone. And that would put NATO in a very difficult position because the United States, obviously by far, is the largest military in NATO. And then in terms of Taiwan, Mr. Biden has actually publicly broken with, 50 years of policy by actually saying he thinks the United States should defend Taiwan. He said it multiple times, gone farther than any president that I can remember. But when Mr. Trump is asked about it, he often will complain about Taiwan's technology and competition and silicon chips and things along those lines. So I think we might expect a pretty different response to a Chinese blockade. So when we look at sort of the two main flashpoints in the world right now, the one in Taiwan would be far greater in terms of impact than the war in Ukraine because the predominance of economic power and growth in East Asia. This is an incredibly consequential election, and the Taiwanese and the Ukrainians and the Eastern Europeans will be watching it extremely closely.
Notre Dame had a event in Washington last month, and I interviewed Admiral Chris Grady, who is the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he talked about the acute threat that Ukraine is, but the larger threat that is China. And that's, that's how they see these two
And I'm glad you say that because China's the ball game. There's no comparison. I mean, Russia is very disruptive and it's asymmetrical, but China has grown dramatically. The economic growth in China has never happened historically in the world before. A country of that size growing so dramatically, building a blue water navy. When I was in the 90s, they couldn't project power off their coastline. They had like Coast Guard cutters and things like that. Now their navy is larger than the United States. And they have very clear ambitions about Taiwan for strategic as well as political reasons. So I think I'm glad that you did that interview because relatively speaking, China is a much greater challenge for the United States and for the world at large.
Well,
I was going to just add one thing about that. In the past, those sorts of threats motivated democratization in the United States. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is clear evidence that the court was being pressured by the State Department on Brown versus Board of Education because it's very hard to be fighting the Cold War and proclaiming that you are the beacon of democracy when your southern states are defined by basically a form of apartheid, right? And so we have seen our responsibility to the world as often a push to move in a more democratizing vision. And if we give up that role in the world, I fear it is bad for our democracy, but it's also, of course, bad for democracy around the world.
That's a great point. I'll just finish up talking about what Christina was saying. It's very hard for the United States these days to use the power of the bully pulpit of democracy when the United States clearly has such profound problems at home. And it wasn't always like that. Again, living in Beijing in the 1990s, the United States had far more influence on Chinese people. The leadership of the Communist Party was afraid of democracy and was afraid of the United States in part because it had so much soft power.
And then when the rest of the world sees an event like January 6th, do they look at us and think, you can't, if you can't make this work, who can?
The Canadians.
The Canadians.
Just saying.
Oh, Canada.
Dave still has a Canadian passport, so this is all just, whatever to him.
Well, on that cheery note, let's open it to questions. We have people who are online who have joined us, and thank you very much. We're glad you're here. You will find under your viewing screen there is a button that you can press to get your question to us, and we have two students here on either side who are going to go and give you a microphone, and I would ask you to state your name and ask a question. And I would really implore you not to make a political statement, but to genuinely ask a question. Let's start here.
Hi, my name is Ben Hameen. I'm with the Kellogg Institute, and my question to you is whether you think, I guess it's a two-sided question. One, whether the courts will be able to save us from anything that happens after this election, and also whether you think that the current administration has taken the threats to democracy seriously from a policy perspective, whether they've taken the necessary steps to try to address that.
Political scientists have always worried that Americans depend too much upon the courts to save them. And this idea that in the end, an impartial court, either at the Supreme Court level or below that, is somehow above politics and will fix everything, I think is false. And one of the ways that we know that those in power don't believe it is the amount of work they put into placing people on the courts and the priority that is, right? And especially in the American court system where so many of these positions are, the federal level at least, lifelong appointments. And so I think the answer to your question is, well, it depends which court, right? It depends who gets this, what law they emphasize, what sort of take they have on this, et cetera. I think many people have been disappointed in many ways in which the court has treated the January 6th insurrection as sort of politics as normal, and we just, a couple people shouldn't probably have broken that glass, as opposed to sort of a full-on insurrection and a problem in that sense.
Yes. Yep. But, yes.
Thank you so much for this great panel. My name is Bill Kakenbasser. I'm a graduate student here at Notre Dame. And my question is actually for Frank, because you brought up the Israeli judicial reforms, but you didn't bring up the media law. And so I'm curious, because obviously the military was pretty against the judicial reforms, but they seem to be kind of okay with the media law. And even earlier today, Associated Press reporters had their equipment seized by officials from the communications ministry as they were reporting on the ongoing atrocities in Gaza. And so even when they're already in compliance with Israel's military censorship laws. So my question is, how do we make sense of this? Are we really out of the woods when it comes to Israeli democracy?
Absolutely not. I mean, I was in the West Bank and in Israel because I couldn't get into Gaza. Now, my wife was very happy about that. It's very dangerous to go into Gaza, but I would I would work in East Africa, when I work in Ukraine, I'm with the soldiers, and you learn a tremendous amount. And in Ukraine, I've almost never worked with military minders. I hang out in safe houses with reconnaissance teams, and they tell you pretty much everything. What Israel's doing is not allowing people to get into Gaza, almost all foreign journalists, which means we really don't know what's going on there. It's incredibly frustrating. It's bad for democracy, because one of the things that I noticed when I was in Israel and when I was in the West Bank, which was so striking, is when you're in Ramallah and you're in a shop, you can see Al Jazeera on the television set, and it is live coverage of people being pulled from the rubble. In Israel, you will see knocked down buildings, but you will not see many victims. And so the perception of what's happening in Gaza is very different, and a lot of that has to do with the way that the media is being handled there. And there's also a lot of self-censorship, because this was an absolutely horrific act, obviously, for Israelis and the world.
Frank, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
When you say that you were not able to get into Gaza, that's because you're a journalist.
Right.
And is that true for all journalists, or
Yes.
is it
The
that
only way
NPR has been singled out?
No. The only way you could get in is if you go into a military embed, which is a dog and pony show, where they won't let you talk to anybody, and they will only show you the tunnels and let you go in only so far. You can't even tell what the tunnel is and where it went. So it's extremely difficult to determine what you're seeing, because it is so controlled. And, other kinds of conflicts that I've covered, and we have many reporters at NPR with much greater experience than I, have had much more access. And I can't tell you, it makes all the difference in the world to be able to spend lots of time with soldiers and civilians in these zones to understand exactly what's going on and what they're experiencing.
Yeah, there are Palestinian producers and camera crews that are already in Gaza. But I think the only correspondent who's actually gotten into Gaza since the war started was CNN's Clarissa Ward, and she went in with an NGO. And she came out, other than the embeds.
And we have a producer, I think a lot of people, a lot of news organizations, I'd be interested to hear what Ann has to say about this. They no longer have producers in Gaza. They have left because it is astonishing what people are suffering through. We have a man named Anas Baba who's been there for ages. He will at times be living in some kind of conditions where it's 150 people sharing 1 or 2 toilets. He's moving around. There will be periods of time where I'm with Daniel Estrin having lunch, and Daniel's our correspondent there. He's done a great job. And he will not have heard from Anas for 8 to 10 hours. And he's worried that Anas is dead. But Anas just keeps doing it, and he's providing a tremendous information and tremendous perspective for listeners here in the United States.
Yes, in the glasses in the second row.
Thank you. My name is Alejandro Gonzalez, PhD student here at Notre Dame. I would like to go back to the point made by Professor Christina about electoral administration and electoral management. I would like to know if you think about the specific measures that can be implemented at the local level to increase trust in elections. I mean, we know that abolishing the electoral college or having like a national authority that organizes elections will be very difficult, but maybe we can think about specific things that can be implemented. For instance, instead of the Secretary of State organizing the election, maybe have more independent bodies at the local level, or other measures that you may think that should be and can be implemented to increase trust and electoral integrity at the local level.
So it's a great and important question. The truth is, a lot of the things that you would expect or want to have happen are already happening. So the election board here, and Elizabeth's going to correct me if I'm wrong, is balanced and has representatives from both the Democratic and the Republican Party. I think one of the things we saw after 2020 was so many local Republicans who were involved in these sorts of balanced boards, spent all this work trying to ensure that there's no bias, et cetera. They were also attacked. Right, and we even see that from Republican secretaries of state. I'm thinking the guy in Ohio in particular, who's like, look, I wanted you to win, Donald Trump, but you are insulting me, my staff, this whole organization that already is designed in a way to be nonpartisan, at least theoretically, right, and have these sorts of adjustments. I do think if there was more funds so that there are more professionals involved instead of relying so heavily on volunteers, if we could really invest in those, and it would also allow, and this is another thing we're seeing post-Shelby, is cutbacks on efforts that states, public funded efforts to get out the vote, to educate people about the vote, et cetera, right? If all I'm getting is partisan news, I'm not getting just from the city, from the county, from the state, this is how our elections work, this is how you're protected, et cetera. And so we've had some presentations in the Rooney Center just this year about what can happen to turnout and to confidence in elections when these organizations in these poorly funded, have access to more funds and more professionalization.
Was it the woman in the blue?
Thank you. Jennifer McCoy, Georgia State University in Atlanta. I have a question for any or all of you about youth vote and attitudes, because I was just reading about polls that surprised me. I think it was the New York Times poll, but that the youth, a couple of things about the youth vote, that it was, one, the issues to them are not what the Democrats are focusing, or what Biden's focusing on, that it's not climate change, women's rights, and Gaza. It is the same as the rest of the population. Inflation, healthcare, and housing are the top issues. But second, what really surprised me was the number of 18 to 29-year-olds, so Gen Z vote, that are saying that, like, close to 50% saying that Biden is more liberal than they are on many issues. And Trump is not necessarily more conservative than they are. I mean, it was just like shocking. And then there's just kind of the general amnesia about the Trump years and looking backwards in the retrospective, saying everything was great, the economy was better, all this kind of stuff. So this seems to be rather dire indications for Biden and the Democrats, and democracy, I would say, for the fall vote. And I wondered what you all are seeing or how you're analyzing this.
Well, one thing we should keep in mind when we're talking about ideological labels with the population as a whole, but maybe especially among young people, that those are often not terms that have much meaning to regular people, normal people, not abnormal people who are sitting in this room, but the regular people. So a question like, is Joe Biden more or less liberal? For many 18 to 29-year-olds, may not be tapping into what we in this room might think that's tapping into, because I suspect that if you got into specific policy issues, a lot of those young people actually are pretty far to the left. They just may not use that term to describe what their view is. But with that said, it is clear from the polling data, at least as of now, that the youth vote is not as squarely behind the Biden-Harris ticket that like it was in 2020. That, however, should not come as a surprise to anyone. That is the nature of incumbency. It doesn't mean that the Democrats should be complacent. They should not. And even if in that particular poll, Gaza did not rank high among 18 to 29-year-olds, I think we have every reason to think that that is going to be an issue, particularly for the most politically engaged 18 to 29-year-olds, so the ones who are most likely to be turning out to vote. And that is a sticky wicket for the Biden administration. It's not clear how they're going to deal with that issue. But if I could step back from the polling in the moment and just make a broader observation about young people today that, again, sort of cuts against my usual tone of being the optimist on the panel. I do worry that we now have at least a half generation, and soon it will be a whole generation of young people, these are the students we're teaching in our classes, who have come of political age in an era when the very state of American democracy is at stake. That is, that they have seen what happens when you have a world in which democratic norms are in question. That's not something their parents or their grandparents lived through. It's something they lived through. I don't think we know what the consequences of that would be, except that we have every reason to think that the way you are socialized into a political system stays with you over the course of your lifetime. And so I am actually very concerned that many of our young people, probably mostly those coming out of homes on the right, although you may find some of this on the left as well, they're growing up in an era where they do not have that fundamental sense of what it means to be part of a democracy, or these ideas of losers' consent and the rule of law and whatnot. And I wish I again had a cheerier note to end on as I make that point, but I don't, except to just highlight that this is an issue that goes far beyond whether or not Biden's able to win the 18 to 29-year-old vote in 2024. Because I'm worried about not 2024, but 2034, 2044, as that group grows and becomes a larger part of the electorate.
Christina, do you have?
No, I'm going to bow to Dave's youth vote expertise.
Frank?
Same.
Same, okay. Yes, in the black top.
I am Laura Gamboa from the University of Utah, soon to be Notre Dame. So I agree with Christina that we live in a minority rule, and increasingly more aggressive power grabs in the US, and this is true elsewhere as well, are driven by the need to keep that minority rule. And so, at least in the short term, I don't see that dynamic changing. So what do we do in the short term? How do we change that? How do we reduce the costs of losing in this country?
So Laura recently wrote a really important book about democratic backsliding, so I don't see why we have to answer this question. So for 20 years, I've told Notre Dame students in my American Political Parties class that if Democrats were serious about this, they would, instead of spending all this campaign money on ads and things, they would just pay for large numbers of Democrats to move out of California and into Utah and the Dakotas and Idaho. Like, you could really change outcomes, right? And shift the Electoral College. It's this geographic sorting that's causing a lot, if not all, of the problem. I think that Laura is raising a really important point, which comes up when we talk about getting rid of the filibuster. It comes up in lots of things, which is that anything that a majority or a winner does to consolidate their power only makes it easier for whoever's elected next to wield that power. And so we talk, well, again, to be more balanced, President Obama did a lot to extend executive power in the United States and give the executive more authority in ways that some people would think sort of go against the more checks and balances, a balance of power in the American political system. And so people have referred to that smoking gun that he left in the White House in the Oval Office for President Trump, right? You've already pushed things this far and you've gotten the courts to say it's okay, and now he's going to use this in a very different way than President Obama did. And so the people who cheered Obama's acts when he was president, in part, have to live with the repercussions when someone else comes into office. And so here, again, I worry that, I think it's important that the opposition party maintains a commitment to democracy above other things, even short-time wins. Now, you have to be careful. Sometimes I know you have to play hardball and et cetera. But I'm thinking, for example, Jeff Lehman and Francis Lee and I wrote a paper about losers' consent. And one of the things we pointed out is that, you know, to their kind of shame, in 2022, we know that Democrats gave money and tried to support election deniers because they believed they'd be weaker candidates in general elections. And again, we might say, boy, worth it to, you know, win these seats. But that itself sets a precedent that's undermining for democracy. And so I think that those on the left, the stakes are really high. And so the incentives to cheat, for lack of a better word, are extraordinarily high. And believe me, there are days in which I also would be willing to, I'm being recorded, nothing. There's nothing I would be willing to do. Never, ever. But I think in the long run, sticking to democratic values is really important.
Yes, in the gray suit jacket with the blue shirt.
Justin Kempf, I host a Democracy Paradox podcast. So, election denialism has primarily been a problem on the right in recent years in the United States. If Donald Trump is elected in this next election, is it possible that we might see the problem of election denialism appear on the left as well? And maybe not in this election, maybe it comes in a future election. But is that a risk that American democracy faces?
In a word, yes. But again, it's hard to say with any certainty because in the current environment, election denialism has been so associated, obviously, with the right or with Trump in particular. But it is worth noting that among his many eclectic positions, RFK Jr. is an election denialist about the 2004 election. This is true, he's on record. And there were people who argued that John Kerry actually won that election and that, you know, Ohio was all corrupt and whatnot. So it's not.
I was in Ohio.
So now we know.
Yeah,
we know what really happened. Dear God.
I'm tempted to ask Anne if she has a brain worm, but my point about that is it is not as though election denialism had never come up before. I mean, you could go back to the 1960 election. There's still being books written over whether or not Kennedy really won that. Yep. The question is whether or not it takes hold in the population, and that requires the kind of ideological echo chamber that we have seen among Trump's acolytes. I see it less likely happening on the left, although I wouldn't rule it out as a zero probability.
So I want to agree that there's no reason to on on the face of it, assume that the left is not just as subjective to the incentives to deny elections. I think you have already seen, though, on the left, a buildup in the other way, which is a confidence, maybe overplaced, in having the majority. And so there's so much reform activity around ranked choice voting, other sorts of election reforms coming up against the Electoral College. At the state level, could we get past, winner takes all and have proportional, all those sorts of things, which I think are just the left's approach to that. It's also true that the left is in general more comfortable with government as a solution, right? We just need to play with the rules a little bit more. I don't want to overstate or overgeneralize from small examples. But I think about things like Me Too. The truth is, Al Franken left office and Harvey Weinberg went to jail. Like there is this idea, and not because the left is perfect on that issue. They are very much not. But there's an extent to which the left in this country, that has become, because the right denies elections, the left must not, right? That's part of the purity and brand that has sort of evolved. And I think that's what happened to Al Franken, right? That we have made this our brand, and therefore we're going to lose someone in order to win the broader brand sort of argument. And that is my expectation, but being a political scientist means often being disappointed in.
So we are just about out of time, but I just want to ask you, after this incredible discussion, for each of you to give us one thing we can do as individuals to strengthen our democracy here in the U.S. and for those who are joining us from around the world. What can people do to strengthen their democracy as individuals?
I mean, volunteer at the local level, drive voter turnout. I mean, this is still a free country. If you saw huge sectors of the electorate voting a certain way and coming out at large percentages, it would move the needle. There's no doubt about that. So it still, I think, is very much in the hands of the people. I mean, again, I'm used to spending time in authoritarian countries, and it's totally different. And the other thing is a greater emphasis, and this is very challenging, on civic education, because it really has changed a lot, and I think has had a big impact.
I think we're all going to say the same thing. I think we all need to stop doom scrolling, assuming that nothing can be done. And I'm a subject to this the next person. I'll teach a class on campaign finance in the United States, and just like, why even bother? I could be home watching Netflix, and it would be much more comfortable. I have a project now that looks at elections to local boards and commissions, and as I learn about that, I am increasingly reminded about how much of politics that matters in people's daily lives happens in the local level. We had a real book banning push in this county. It was inspiring to go to those library board meetings and see people standing up for values and shutting that down. And so I think the threats are real, but I do think that, as you just said, we still have opportunities to make a difference through democratic politics in this country.
Get a dog. Which I say only half in jest, because you should go rescue a dog from a shelter. I say that because one of the things that I think we have to do as a society is learn, as we were saying earlier, how to disagree with one another. And I will say this is a critique that applies to the left and the right. I don't want to make any assumptions about people's ideological proclivities in the audience, but just in case you happen to find yourself on the political left, both liberals and conservatives, progressives and libertarians, whatever your label in the country, are inclined to hunker down in ideological cocoons. And that's something that we need to correct. It's not easy to do. I don't claim that I'm good at it. Talking with my in-laws, oh my gosh. But I do, at least in the abstract, recognize that this is what we have to do. And I would hope that as we do that, as we make connections across those lines of division, we can demonstrate, if you're representing one team, you can demonstrate to the other team that we're not all monsters. And that maybe there is some common ground, because I would actually point to, and this is an interesting development in American politics, because we're seeing this shifting of who's supporting which party in this period of political turbulence, we actually are seeing some very interesting coalitions come together. So politically, it actually is possible for people who we might otherwise think of as opponents to agree on some issues. They just don't get as much attention as maybe some of the more contested issues are. That gives me some hope that maybe, just maybe, we might survive 2024.
And I would just
Dog park, that's your.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would just echo what Dave said. Talk to somebody who you know you don't agree with politically and have a civil conversation. Because we have to talk to each other. We have to listen to each other to move the country forward, I think. And I think we need to learn to talk to each other again. Don't mimic cable TV. And I realize that's not really what I do, but have a civil conversation. Our democracy depends on it. Annabelle, there you are, hi. You have something that you would like to say to us? And I believe it involves food.
And thank you for this, Dave, Christina, Frank, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. Thank you so much.